Welcome to the VB Toolbox. This is part 2 in a series on accessing Microsoft SQL Database with Visual Basic.NET. In this tutorial segment, we will be covering how to query your database using your VB application. In part 1, we established a connection to our database and tested that connection. We'll start where we left off in that tutorial, and we'll be using the same code as the base. We'll start by opening that project. And now let's go to our Solution Explorer and open our SqlControl class that we created, if you don't already have that open. In part 1, we created a SQL command, and what this allows us to do is fire a query at the database using whatever your open connection is. In this case, it's SqlConn, which provides our connection string to our database. We've already tested the connection. We're going to go ahead and add a new sub to this, and I'm going to call this sub public sub run query. And let's go ahead and provide a query string. So I'm going to say query as string for the parameter. And in here we're going to use the try catch to make sure that we catch any errors that are returned from our query. So we'll say try, and it'll generate that code for us when we hit enter. And as before, we're going to use the SqlConn open and SqlConn close. So if you want, you can just copy and paste that down there in the try section. And for the exception catching, I'm going to say messagebox ex.message to capture any errors that we may have in our query. What we can do this in a couple of different ways. The first way I'm going to show you is how to read directly from the SQL Server using the SQL Data Reader. That'll allow us to capture records pretty much as we see fit as it's iterating through those records. So to kind of give you an example, I'm going to go ahead and comment this. I'm going to say read directly from the database. And I'm going to create a SQL Data Reader by saying dim r as SQL Data Reader. And I'm going to set that to be equal to our SQL command. So SqlCMD, and the method we'll be using is execute reader. Next step, what we have to do is while this connection is open and this is reading, we want to loop through the records. So I'm going to say while r.read, and that gives us a loop. So as long as it's reading from the database and it hasn't come to the end, it will continue to return those values that we choose. So what we'll say, let's do message box. And there are two ways to return our records. You can call the records. We can say r and provide an index value. So 0 is always the first record. And if you have returned multiple records, you can do r1, r2. And another thing we can do is actually return the column name by using the data reader's getName method. So let's go ahead and return the column name first. I'm going to say r.getName, and I want to return the name of the first column in our query. And I'm going to concatenate on the value of that column. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a colon and a space there to separate the column name and the data that's in the cell. So I'm going to concatenate that on as well, and that should do it. So here we should be reading directly from the first table the first column in the first cell that is returned. So I think that's all we need there. Let's go ahead and try creating a simple query here to our database. Again, to kind of review what I'm using here from part 1, I created a SQL Express server on an old box, and the database I'm using is my SQL Apps database. And I've created a simple forum structure for that. So I've got a members table, the forum boards, forum threads, and forum replies. So I'm going to run a simple query, something similar to this here. So let's just jump back to our application and go to form 1 in the code. You can get there by double-clicking your form. And I'm going to go ahead and comment out our test message. This will check to see that the connection is available from our first video. And if it is successful, we'll say SQL, calling out the instance of our SqlControl class that we created, SQL dot run query, that's the new method we created, and now we need a query string. If you're familiar with the SQL language, which you should be for this tutorial, we're going to do a select, and I'm just going to grab the usernames from my members table. So I should be able to run this query, and it should loop through the available rows and grab the first cell in the first column. Oh, you see, I made a mistake here. I just now saw that. You might have seen it. The first index value is always 0. These are 0 base. So I want to grab the column name of the first column and the record in the first cell. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and it says object reference is not set to an instance of the object. So we know that our catch exception is working properly. So what you can see that I did wrong here is I tried calling my SQL command without actually creating that command. So I'm going to come right up here and I'm going to say SqlCMD equals new SQL command. And the parameters I will use for that are my query string. I'm going to pass this query into this connection. I'm going to use my SqlCon. So using a new instance of the SQL command to call upon this using this query, which we've provided here. So let's go ahead and run that again. And it's connecting. And there it is. So it has returned the column name, which is username, and added my little colon on there and a space, and return the username from that field. And it's going to loop through until it hits the end of that table, and then it will quit. So it's going to show us each user. Now that's kind of cool, and we know it works now, but it's not very useful to be firing back message boxes. So what I'm going to want to do is use a data grid and fill that with the information from my query. So rather than using a data reader, what I will end up doing is adding a SqlDataAdapter and creating a data set. So let's go ahead and add at the top of our class here, I'm going to add public SqlDA as SqlDataAdapter, and public SQL dataset as a dataset. All right. Now we will scroll down and let's go ahead and comment out this data reader, because we don't want to use that anymore. We're going to do this a little bit differently. Now that we know we can query our database, I'm going to say load SQL records for DataGrid. Now we don't actually have a DataGrid yet. We will create that in a moment. First off, what we need to do is set our DataAdapter to reference our SQL commands. So we'll say SqlDA equals a new instance of the SqlDataAdapter, and we'll pass the SqlCMD into that. So that fires our query and connection into the DataAdapter, and SqlDataset will be equal to a new dataset, creates a fresh dataset, and we're going to fill the dataset with whatever comes out of our SQL DataAdapter. So what we'll do is we'll say SqlDA dot fill, and then we'll just pipe in our SQL data set. Pretty simple. Excuse me. So what that does, this creates a new data adapter referencing our query and our connection. This creates a brand new instance of a data set, and this fills the data set with data. Now you can't actually see that data as it is. If you wanted, you could actually probe that data using various methods, but instead what we're going to want to do is pipe that into a data grid on our main form, so it's a little more friendly and easier to read. Now there's one other thing. Once we start querying, it adds a second point of possible failure in our routine. So instead of maybe just crashing because it wasn't able to open the database, it might also crash because of the query. So what I'm going to want to do is say, if it crashes here, it if there are any errors or exceptions, it's going to jump directly to our exception catch and fire whatever's in here, and then it's going to return back to the form, but it may not have actually closed the connection before it did that. So we need to make sure that connection's closed before we try issuing any more queries to the database. So I'm going to say if SqlConnection.state equals connection state open, then SqlCon.close. Okay, so that way it tries to close it if it's still open, even if there's an error and it skips over this one up here. Alright, so now we need some form controls to play with this query. I'm going to go ahead and save my project here and return to the main form. Let's go ahead and stretch that out just a little bit so we have a little more to work with. Now, because I intend to use this same project throughout this tutorial series, I'm going to try to keep it organized and nice here. And to do that, I'm going to use a tab control to separate our activities into tabs. So let's go ahead and grab a tab control from your toolbox and draw that to the screen. And I'm going to rename that. Let's see, in our properties, go up to the name. We can see that. tab control. I'm just going to call it TCSQL in case I ever have to reference it. And I want to modify my collection here, so I'm going to go back down to the bottom, find our collection of tab pages. I'm sorry. Look for the tab pages, and we're going to modify that collection by clicking on the little ellipsis there. And all I want to do is just change the tab text on the first page to query, and then we'll hit OK. Now let's add a couple more controls to this guy. First up, I'm going to want a text box to type my query into, so I'm going to grab a text box, drag it on there, and we're going to want to make that multi-line. So with your text box selected, go into the properties, and first thing we'll change is the name. I'm going to call this txt query, and then I will make it multi-line. Set that to true. That allows us to expand out there a bit. And I'm going to add a command button next. And I'm going to draw a great big one right over here for fun. And I will call that, let's see, I'm just going to call it, I'm going to change the text label to run query. And I'm going to change the name of that to CMD query. And now for our output data grid. This will be located down a ways. Oh no, it's not. It's right there in the middle. So let's go ahead and grab a data grid, drop it on our form. And I'm not going to use any of the data grid tasks. We're going to do this all in code. So go ahead and size that up on your form. That looks good enough. And I am going to change the name of that to, instead of having that long name, I'm going to do DataGridView DGV and data. So this will be where our data comes out. Alright, that's pretty simple. Okay, now with these, what I'm going to do is use this text box to create our query so we can actually type in there, and then we'll be able to hit the run button, run a query to the database, and then output that data to our DataGrid view. So to do this, let's go ahead and double click on our command button. And if you want, you can run your connection test again to make sure you have a connection before you try running a query. Just like we did in part 1, we'll say if SQL.hasConnection equals true, then go ahead and proceed. We could also test to make sure that there's actually some text in the text box if you wanted. That's up to you. I'm just going to go ahead and say SQL.runQuery, and the query string will just be whatever is in our text box. So txtQuery.text. Simple enough. And to avoid any errors on this side, if this crashes, it may not be captured in our catch or try catch over here in the class. So let's just make sure that it actually returns a value before it tries filling the data grid with information. Actually, what can happen is, if you run a query and it doesn't return any data, your data table may be non-existent. So if we try accessing that index, it'll crash on us from this side. So we'll say if SQLDataset.tables.count is greater than 0, then proceed. Okay, so we want to at least make sure there's, you know, one table in our data set before we try filling in our grid. So we'll say DataGridView data source equals our SQL .SQL dataset .tables, and the first table it finds, which is really all there should be, it should fill in our data grid with that data set. So I think we're ready to go ahead and give this a try. I'm going to go ahead and save first. Oops, before we do that, let's get rid of this test code from our form load. Go ahead and just backspace that or delete it. And let's try running our application. I'm just going to click start there. Looking good so far. So let's see, what do we want to query? I'm just going to do a basic query. I'm going to say select star from members. And I'm going to hit run query and see if that works. Oh, have a look at that. It's beautiful. So, what happens if we leave this blank and try to run it? Ooh, doesn't like that. Execute reader command text property has not been initialized. Let's go ahead and come back to our code here, and let's wrap this here. Let's say if txtQuery.text is not equal to nothing, then go ahead and proceed. We'll end if down there. Whoops. See if that fixes it. Ah, there we go. Now we can't run a blank query. So that works pretty good. Can we do more complex queries? We could try it out. Oops. Let's try it. Let's see. Select username from members, where username is like, throw a wildcard in there, and we'll say AM, end it with a wildcard, run the query. Look at that. Worked beautifully. You can also do more complex queries like joins and things like that. We could say members inner join forum threads on members dot username equals forum threads dot, oh, what is that, author, I believe is the field. Look at that. So it picked up one thread in our discussion forum, wherever it found this user as being an author in that forum. So it works great. Okay, so that is how you query the database using your application. I'm going to try going ahead and create a bad query here. Select member name from database. See what happens. Incorrect syntax near keyword database. Valid column name, member name. Let's see. Select forum replies dot body from forum replies. Look at that. So that is working quite well. Not sure why it dropped it in another column. Maybe it's because we added it in after the fact. What if we delete that, query it, add it back on, and there it is. Interesting. So I guess that concludes this tutorial. That is how you populate a data grid from your SQL database information. And you know, we've created a really cool little query screen here for checking up on our records. What we're going to be learning in the future is how to insert new records, delete records, and also update records in our database. So a lot of neat stuff to come. I hope that this has been very helpful for you. There's just a number of other things we could cover, but that's the basics of querying your database into a data grid. So if this has been useful, consider sharing it with anyone else that you think would find it useful. Thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.